bring you Killer Wives, episode 44. Death after dinner. These are the case facts against Penelope Jackson, who repeatedly stabbed her husband to death. Isn't trust a bitch? We're of the United Kingdom, a coastal village region made famous for its holiday stays, the 13th century St. Mary's Church, but also made famous by the murder of one Mr. David Jackson. As the largest city in the United Kingdom retires for the night, and the last travelers have cleared the tracks of the London Underground, all is now quiet. But that does not mean that all is well. Instead of me telling you, let me take you beyond the city's limits towards a coastal town where myths of vampires, monsters, and legends of evil could hardly match the sheer cold-hearted ferociousness of a vengeful wife with a large-bladed knife. For on this night, across the vast expanse of the United Kingdom, westward through a dense forest to a foggy coastal village, where a former British officer is about to be murdered in cold blood by his wife of 24 years, Mrs. Penelope Jackson. True Evil had come to visit 3 Canberra Parsonage Road on Saturday the 13th of February 2021. The killing had what started out as a celebration of Mrs. Jackson's birthday with a shared meal over Zoom with their daughter, only to denigrate into a stabbing with a long-bladed kitchen knife. You know, I don't know what it is, but wives tend to lean towards knives and poisons to take out their husbands. Now here are the facts of the case. Mrs. Jackson insists she momentarily lost control of her mental faculties that night after claiming her retired lieutenant colonel husband, now mind you, that he was coercive, controlling, physically violent. If he was all of those things, why are you still alive and he is still dead? Now she says she ultimately lost control when he called her the word pathetic. If somebody called me pathetic and I had to kill him, there's something really wrong with me, not them. There's many names I've been called in life. Now I want to warn you, as I frequently do viewers of Killer Wives, that the deceased spouse is never present to defend themselves. You see, all we have to go on after death is the testimony, rants, and ravings of the wives who killed them and are still alive with us today. Regardless if she's locked up for life or not, she is still here. When these particular women either tell what their husbands did or said, it has no true bearing on the case as far as I'm concerned. Why? Because some of these ladies carried on such a bad relationship with these men that I'm sure the deceased wouldn't want them to be speaking for them while they are alive, let alone dead. I've counseled a lot of people in the past. I've seen some really bad behaviors from people who are society considers either low income all the way up to the top that they consider rich. But regardless of what you are about to hear from her testimony, Mrs. Jackson was no victim. You see, in truth, Mrs. Jackson went to the bedroom where her husband had been lying on top of the bed, shirtless, and slashed him across the chest, deeply. Penelope believed she had gravely wounded her husband for sure, and then she proceeded to leave the bedroom, hoping that he would die. That's correct. She was hoping that that slash would have killed him. She thought it was deep enough. But minutes later, as if she saw a ghost, Mrs. Jackson was shocked out of her mind to see Mr. Jackson, aged 78 years, emerge from the bedroom, bleeding profusely, en route to the home telephone where he could call the police on his wife. She couldn't have that. This was going to get her arrested. She was going to lose what a lot of young ladies don't like to lose, and older women, is a public face. If Mr. Jackson was the aggressor in this case, then why would he be laying down flat, unclothed in his bed instead of injuries his wife, as she did to him? Now, in shock and shaking, Mr. Jackson called emergency services for help. So he got him on the phone. They were talking to him. He was explaining what had happened in the situation and they needed help. Unfortunately for Mr. Jackson, the brutality had not ended, but had just begun. When Penelope figured that Dave was calling authorities on her, she did as other abusers do. She went over to him and stabbed him deep in his abdomen, slicing vital organs, and for good measure, she pulled the blade out and stabbed him once more, even deeper, before throwing the knife to the kitchen floor. And that's where authorities would find it when they showed up, next to his body. Now, during the last two stabs, David would be heard by the emergency operator as he pleaded with her to stop. Now, that phone line would stay open for 18 long minutes until police and medical aid would arrive due to the coastal positioning of their upscale community. See, they lived on the coast. The closest police station was quite a ways away. Now, it would appear over this duration of time that the dispatcher would converse with Mr. Jackson before ultimately finishing the conversation with Mrs. Jackson. Why? Did he pass her the phone? No. Mrs. Jackson, after her husband's passing, at her own hands had to take the phone call because the line was still open. You see, in a moment, we will play for you a brief portion of that actual emergency call. Now, we cannot play for you the part where he is being stabbed, but we will pay you, give you a brief portion of that tape. Now, in that call, you can hear Miss Jackson repeatedly refusing to help her bleeding and dying husband as emergency dispatchers requested that she take steps to stem the bleeding at least. You see, at one point, the dispatcher said if she didn't want to help him, could she at least just throw him a towel so that he could put pressure on his own wounds? Now, what did she say to that? I mean, they wanted her to do this just at least until they arrived so they could help him. But to that, Penelope answered, no, I won't. She said if medical aid wants to help him, they can, but I certainly will not. Now, if that's what you get from a wife after 24 years, you've got my vote. She could win Wife of the Year for this kind of behavior. Now, here's a brief glimpse of that very distressing emergency call after her husband is laying on the kitchen floor, dying.
And are you with him now?
Well, I might just go and stab him again, but...
Alright, do not stab him again.
No.
Okay, so just listen to my voice. Okay, stay on the line with me.
I am completely...
Okay, are you with the patient now?
Well, I'm in the lounge, just bleeding to death, isn't that?
Alright, so just stay on the line with me.
Well, this is not... You're not paid enough to be with me. It's not fair.
Okay, well ultimately, madam, I'm listening to your voice and you're the help I have available, so we need to help him, okay?
No, I'm not.
Alright, madam,
I don't...
how many times have you stabbed him?
I did the one.
You did the once?
And then, instead of doing it again, did the third time.
So, okay, so in total, how many times?
3 times.
3 times, okay.
Once I thought I got his hair, well, I got one, and then sliced the abdomen.
In that terrifying 18-minute recording, which we could not play for you in its entirety, Mrs. Jackson is heard saying, I thought I got his heart, but he hasn't got one. Now I ask you, does this sound like the words of a victim? Does it sound like the words of a person who could not defend himself? When police and ambulance crews arrived at the couple's bungalow that night, paramedics found Mr. Jackson in the kitchen with the fatal knife wounds lying on the floor where she had left him. Mr. Jackson had succumbed to his injuries over those precious 18 minutes, while his wife of 24 years had refused to render him assistance. Now, she worked for the government at one time. She worked for the Department of Defense in her country. But instead, she would be caught telling paramedics that with any luck, you'll be too late as they enter their home with the police in tow. Your own wife tells the paramedics, I hope you're too late and I hope he's already dead. This is not going to be good for a court case because the police officers were filming it with a body camera.
Step outside for me a minute. Can you come outside?
Yes.
Thank you.
He's on the kitchen floor.
Okay, at this moment in time, okay, you just listen to my colleague. Under arrest suspicion of attempt murder, mate.
Under arrest with suspicion of attempt murder. You do not have to say anything. It may harm your defence. You do not mention when questioned anything you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence.
I'll go in and see what they do.
Yeah.
Could I get my coat?
Just bear with me 2 seconds.
In there. I admit it all.
Alright.
I stabbed him
Once.
because he's a... He's an aggressive bully and nasty, and I've had enough.
Alright, Penny. I'm further arresting you for murder.
Oh, good.
Now, the next morning after her arrest, detectives continued to try and piece together a recipe for murder in which a marriage that wasn't facing any physical problems in a very quiet, older community of couples who were well off, how could it end so violently? How could it be so destroyed by one happening? What took place? So, crime scene tape being strung out would be enough to pull many local residents and neighbors to venture towards the address in hopes of discovering what had happened. Now, here are a couple of pictures of the interior of the home where the murder took place. Not only was murder in this community odd, but this particular cruel happening was out of order for what friends and relatives believed was a very happy marriage. You see, most people thought of the mixed pair as a complimentary, gregarious party host wife and a quiet, unassuming husband. If you hear me talk a lot of times on this channel, I'll tell you that opposites attract just before they repel each other. But most marriages are of opposite nature because they blend better than the same nature, but in this case, not. In that house, on the couple's kitchen table, investigators discovered a confession note. In it, Penelope writes how she had taken so much over the years and described her husband as a good daddy, but said of him, the mask had slipped and she accepted her punishment. So she was writing out an excuse for what she had done. Instead of taking the blame, she was writing an excuse. The detectives would note for the record that shortly after talking to Mrs. Jackson after the murder, how she was quiet, clear, and composed in her mind about what she had done. And she was very open that she had stabbed her husband 3 times, and she seemed quite happy about it, quite comfortable with herself. You see her, just like you see her in that tape, it did not bother her a bit. She was actually happy to have it done. She was hoping that it had done correctly, that he would not still be alive. Now, body cam footage from the time of her arrest would lay bare her calm demeanor and glee to his passing. In an interrogation room when they took her downtown, she gave a frank admission of the attack on her 78-year-old husband, where she heard saying, I should have stabbed him a bit more. Can you imagine? Just a little bit more. She says, and if I hadn't done it properly, I'll be really annoyed. So she didn't know whether he was dead when they took him away from the house. She was hoping that he was. She was going to be very dismayed if they got there on time to save the life of a 78-year-old man. Her behaviors were odd for a murder in the statement she made the night of the stabbing. This was evident when she was informed that she was being arrested on suspicion of murder. And she replied, oh good, and went on to say, I have no intentions of not agreeing to what I've done. And odder still, she confessed these words to detectives. She said, I tell you what, you don't get any murders in Barrow When she said Barrow, she was meaning the coastal community that they lived in. And she was right. To history, we checked it. No matters in Barrow, in that tiny little area where they lived at. But ultimately, Miss Jackson would gain some clarity after being locked up before trial, which a lot of criminals do. They may be braggadocious about what they did during that moment. When they find out they're going to spend a lifetime in jail, they change their story to a defensive story. But she would dramatically alter her story from being prideful about killing her husband to being a complete victim in the situation, who, as she said, feared for her life. Now, during Penelope's trial, she would go on to make allegations of domestic abuse, which were not backed up by the bulk of her family members or friends. But several witnesses will note that the Jacksons had at times a very contentious relationship, but nothing really at the level that somebody would want to commit murder. And I counsel couples for years, and I can tell you that at the least end of the spectrum to the highest end of the spectrum, a lot of people have conflict. A lot of cases they don't get along. Some people want to leave each other, but the majority don't want to murder one another. Now, the deceased second wife, Mrs. Sheila Taylor, said it was David who was frightened of his wife, who had once threatened to cut his penis off if he ever left her. She said he honestly believed that she was capable of carrying out the threat. Now, she made this threat in comparison, as she made reference to doing to him what Lorena Bobbitt did to her husband. And if you remember that particular case, it was all across the media where Lorena Bobbitt cut off the penis of her husband. Now, his daughter from his first marriage, Jane Calverley, would testify that Penelope liked making people feel very uncomfortable as a sense of pleasure. She got off on making people feel bad. And I'm sure in life you ran into some people just like this. She said when David was with Penelope, he always seemed like he was on edge. She said, I always felt everything had to revolve around Penelope. And I'm sure you know people who are like that. Life must revolve around them. Now, Jane continued on by saying that Penelope enjoyed finding people's sore spots and poking them. Now, I even have family members that do this. They find your sore spot. They try to poke it. Until you overcome that, then it doesn't bother you anymore. Now, his daughter also recalls staying with Penelope and her father when she was having trouble with her own husband in marriage. Now, as Calverley said, Penelope at the time had advised her, now listen to this, that it's much easier if your husband kills himself. So at that time, she already had a penchant for killing the person that you're closest to. But beyond the testimony of those who would defend a dead man over a living woman was whether the jury would accept that there was a long history of domestic violence as Penelope had claimed. And secondly, did that domestic violence justify her loss of control on that particular evening? Now, a lot of these cases, whether it be over in the UK, like this case, or in the United States, when the young ladies, older ladies, are caught in this particular situation, they will scream domestic violence, or their attorneys will tell them to claim it. Now, the prosecution would lay out evidence that Penelope was really, really calm after the murder. And to hear some of the allegations she made during the trial must have been awful for the family to hear that she was a victim. Now, there's a first time in cases like this when you go to court, where family members hear things that never existed or things that did exist that they knew nothing about from the outside. Prosecutors showed how Penelope stabbed David not just once, but she went back and stabbed him twice more, and she wanted him to die, which was made clear from the case evidence. The couple's adult daughter, Isabel Potterton, shown here at her wedding, said her parents seemed to be enjoying a happy retirement, but often bickered over small things. Now, this with her mother's temper flaring and quickly passing, while her father had a tendency to just sulk. And a lot of guys do sulk within themselves. They know they can't stand up because they'll be arrested for abuse. She said that she would miss her father, who always showed up to fix things at her apartment, even if she didn't know they were broken and needed fixing. Now, you might have a lot of uncles or fathers or grandfathers that do this. They enjoy fixing things for you to make it easier. Further testimony from son-in-law Tom Potterton was that he had seen the couple arguing, but it was relatively short-lived and forgotten about, and nothing he was concerned about. So nobody from the outside actually believed that this would happen. And in the home that these cases exist is because nobody on the outside believed it would happen. Now, next door neighbor in Barrow testified that he often spoke with Mr. Jackson, whom he described as being a good friend. He said, "We got on very well. He would do anything for me." He said, "Most mornings I would go out and we'd have a chat for a few minutes. And to be honest, I couldn't ask for a better friend," he said.
You're watching MNN, the Men's Channel.
On the second day of Jackson's murder trial, the jury heard that the 78-year-old victim had been her fourth husband, and she was his third wife. Sheila Taylor, Mr. Jackson's second wife, told the court her marriage to David had ended when he began an affair with Penelope in 1993, and that she believes he was very frightened of her. So Penelope was not his wife at the time, but another wife. And his other wife has been cheated on with Penelope. It's always the last woman that'll get you. And Miss Taylor told the court she had learned of the affair when Penelope rang their home and demanded to speak to her husband. If you're a married wife, there's a lot of instances where wives will call the one who's cheating with their husband, or the cheater will call the wife. She said he had been white and shaking when he came off the phone talking to her. She said he told me he had been having an affair with a woman called Penny, but the relationship was now over. The relationship may have been over with him, but the relationship was not over with Penny. Now, Penelope at that time didn't want the relationship to be over, though, and she was insisting he could tell me about it and go and live with her, she said. He was frightened she would destroy his army career and destroy his reputation. And there's no doubt in her mind, she said, that she was capable of doing just that. Now, I ask you again, even in your neighborhood, you know people who do this. You know people who act like this. You know women who destroy people's career, not just over affairs, but other incidents. Now, but at the conclusion of that trial, Penelope Jackson, aged 66 years at the time, was found guilty at Bristol Crown Court of the murder of her husband, David Jackson, aged 78, whom she stabbed 3 times at their home in Somerset before telling a 999 operator, "I thought I'd get his heart, but he hasn't got one." She forgot that she did not have one for doing that. Now, Judge Martin Picton imposed a life sentence with an 18-year minimum sentence after a 10-2 verdict from a jury of 8 women and 4 men. Judge Martin Picton said, "I have no doubt you intended to kill your husband, and it was premeditated murder. So even the judge, you could not fool him, no matter the claims of abuse." He said, "Your behavior shows a shocking level of callousness. During the 4 days of giving evidence, I did not detect a shred of genuine remorse on your part for the crime you have committed." So a lot of instances, a lot of these women believe that they've done nothing more than like a traffic ticket, hitting a fly. But this is murder. The judge said he had given a higher sentence than the 15-year minimum outlined in the sentencing guideline, owing to the physical harm inflicted on David Jackson, to whom she had been married for 24 years. Now that is a long time before you think about killing somebody. And to this year, I've been married 36 years. I definitely wouldn't want anybody to do that to me. Now, during the high-profile 2-week trial, the defense lawyer Claire Wade sought to persuade the jury that Penelope Jackson had a loss of control after being pushed to the edge by long-term intermittent abuse. In each and every case, be it this country or another, where there's murder by a wife, they will always go that she was either hurt or abused at home. However, jurors decided that despite the allegations of abuse, Jackson was in control of her actions on the evening she killed her husband, and that her behavior was not consistent with that of a person with a normal degree of tolerance and self-restraint. So a normal person with a degree of tolerance and self-restraint would either leave the house, call the police, call it quits, anything. First option is not murder. And Judge Picton would end by saying, "There was no doubt tensions in the marriage, points of friction, the pandemic lockdown will have accentuated, but I'm quite sure he was nothing like the person you claimed. I know I might have forgot to mention at the beginning of the story, this murder occurred during the height of the pandemic." So a lot of people confuse that violence occurred more in the home during the pandemic. Now, addressing the court, David Jackson's estranged daughter from a former marriage, Jane Calverley, accused Penelope Jackson of being the abuser in the relationship and suggested that she had taken advantage of a culture, just like in this country, that does not support male victims of domestic violence. So, typically you will always hear in these cases is a projectionism. She projected on him what she actually was. She called him the abuser, but actually she was the abuser. The person who ends up murdering somebody typically is the abuser. And she said, "My father was a proud man, and this consequently cost him his life. He would not seek help from someone bullying, berating, and psychologically controlling him, because he would have been viewed that as a man he should not be experiencing this, and felt shame," she said. See, a lot of men never report abuse, even in this country, because they don't want to appear as being weak, that they couldn't handle something in their own home, that their wife is actually as dangerous as they could be. And that's why a lot of guys in a situation are beneath ground today. Now, before her sentencing, Miss Jackson said in her defense that she stabbed her husband after sharing a birthday meal, where they argued over a side dish to the meal, and then over the location of an iPad charger before she retreated to the main bedroom carrying a kitchen knife. And she told the jury she had planned to use it for self-defense, so she's pretended that she might have been scared of him. And then she said later she can use it to take her own life. So now she goes that he is dangerous. I might have used it to take my own life. A knife is not a good way to take your own life. Now, Penelope said she had entered their bedroom at home seeking an apology for the events of the evening when David failed to say he was sorry, she said. She informed him of her intention to take her own life at that time, she said. And then she said that he had go to her suggesting she get on with it. Now, I don't know. See, we can't really answer for a guy who's no longer here. If we heard something like that, you're like, hey, that's pretty bad on his part, right? Now, Penelope told the court this was the moment when she lost it. She said, "I just thought, I cannot do this. It is not fair, and I lost control." She said, "I thought it shouldn't be me, it should be him." But again, this is a testimony of a loving woman to a dead man. Now, for Killer Wives, this is Charles Rivers. Hopefully we will see you here again for episode number 45, on the way to 1,000 episodes. Thank you for watching.